It should be live by now, probably. Just doing usual. Make sure the microphone. Yes. Oh. See, I would have. Well, I did forget. Uh, Important. See, I would have. Well, I did forget. It's always something. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we did it. Enough of that. Yes. Anyway, yeah. So this is just the. I want to try to do this when there's not a John Chappelle. I don't know who the hell is John Chappelle anyway. Natural Philosophy Society physics discussion room thing. Um, so there's one of those usually, sometimes on Saturdays, and so I'm doing this just in case any of those people are interested in continuing any conversation with me. Um, you get in the room, just ask for the link to the room, provide your email address, and I'll send you the link. Probably, if you're trustworthy, if you have a real account of some kind. Anyway, um, yeah, that's probably enough. So this week they have been doing their convention, whatever you call it, meetup. And really, they pulled it off quite well. I mean, it's just kind of unfortunate that they, the people presenting, are the only people there, and you uh, just it's too bad that there isn't more interest in physics in terms of doing something to challenge. I mean, clearly that's what has to happen. Is it has to be challenged. I mean, this the the establishment, the ivory tower um, intellectuals of physics, whatever you want to call them. I'm not saying they haven't earned some kind of status, but they're clearly talking from a very weak position and making very uh, confident statements from that weak position. And, that's just so obviously not the way you're supposed to do science. Um, and it does have implications in that any um, this whole idea of finding the truth, um, they've only found little pieces of truth, but they don't have truth pointing in any right direction, I would argue. And that clearly, because of these traditional dogmatic, um, revered assumptions, maybe that's the way to put it, revered assumptions. They have some weakly evidenced revered assumptions, and that's not doing good science either. Um, so anyway, um, so it's been interesting watching some of these people. Yeah, I can't say they've convinced me of anything. Some of the arguments are better than other arguments. It's all a little bit too chaotic in the sense that physics is kind of a complex subject. It has lots of little elements to it. I mean, you could spend quite a lot of time just studying electrons and all the data on electrons, or all the data on protons, or all the data on chemistry. Ooh, we can go forever for there. Um, Lots of information on magnetism, lots of experiments, lots of different little um, curious things that usually have an explanation. Usually there's some kind of phenomenon that you're not expecting, and it's like unusual and strange. And when you finally dissect it, you realize, oh, okay, they're all going this way, but when you shorten the distance, they all end up getting the same frequency or some. There's little things to know in this kind of stuff, but it's all kind of a massive subject, especially when you get into these different ways of acquiring information using different technologies. So you got all the satellite data that using different technologies to see X-rays or see something else, and then you have the particle physics with the accelerators, and you got things like LIGO. Um, and all based on a whole bunch of science itself, specific science, essentially, um, to that, you know, um, to that, to the technology specific to that kind of instrument, let's say. Um, but then they make all kinds of declarations. You hear people talking about like how they've seen electrons and with electron microscopes, and they haven't done that. And even seeing atoms, they haven't really seen the atoms. They've synthesized the information, using um, probability, and essentially assumed, created a fake average impression. And that average impression would be something like the real impression we would get, because we sort of get an average impression of everything. Things could be blinking. I mean, this pen could be blinking at 500 hertz, you know, and I wouldn't be able to see it. Wouldn't look like blinking to me. So, I mean, its actual condition can be one thing, and what I perceive can be another. So that adds to all this complexity. So anyway, so they make all these videos, and they're all disconnected pieces of physics. And I just don't think anybody could be up to speed enough on all of these different elements of physics to be able to know know the junk from the not junk, where the gimmicks are. You know, lots of pretending they have this new formula that's the same as this other formula, except it's completely different. Lots of that kind of stuff. Like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to do that on the fly. I'm going to just sit there and analyze this, 15 level mathematical formula to demonstrate that somehow you're right about something. So I just don't think there can be any, in some of these cases, I don't think there can be rational analysis at the level that some of the information is provided, because, most people aren't going to have the capacity to do anything with that. They're not going to be able to challenge it. Even physicists, because you'd have to get yourself up to speed on the specific relevant established formula and relationships that are known and experiments that are rock solid, that kind of stuff. And asking too much. So I think the idea of presenting this counter to conventional physics has to start with first constructing a bunch of arguments that have to do with what's wrong with conventional physics. First, the idea that the evidence for many of their conclusions is incredibly weak. Tiny amount of experimental data, not a volume of data, a tiny amount of relevant, meaningful, explicit, maybe. It's a really bad image if you were going to judge it based on a camera image and resolution. The picture they have taken of the truth with their experiments is a really grainy, really crappy picture. And I think you really see that with things like particle physics, where you can't see you only see these little bits of stuff indirectly, based on how they travel through a medium, of atoms or ions or something. They leave a trail, which in itself takes time. So to manifest, so you're not even seeing them in real time. When you're measuring how long they last, or measuring how long they lasted, not last, because you're not going to see the results until well after the thing actually happened, the event, in terms of the scale of time. And so they've created all kinds of these new particles, and all these particles really represent is yes, it acts just like a proton, except we don't think a proton can do what we're seeing. So it's essentially a proton, but because it's doing something that they don't think protons do, they call it an anti-electron, or a positron, or some other. They give it a name as if it's a different thing, when technically you have to accept their logic that goes into their deductions about what a proton can and cannot do, and what it means when a proton's moving, and what it means when a proton collapses into something, um, merges, whatever the right word would be. Um, and those are all assumptions. So again, a very grainy image, and they've created all kinds of hundreds of particles that really only have a simple characteristic of charge or no charge, you know, and and have a momentum. Um, and then they've created this whole new thing of the a whole range of antiparticles, and none of this stuff has any obvious function. Um, and in their model, the function is very convoluted, and that's why they need the Higgs boson and all this other stuff, is they have to create this very convoluted mechanism that holds this stuff together. And all of that in the understanding that they still haven't been able to figure out what charge is. They're still stuck with the idea of virtual energy as explanations for things, and here they are taking on the challenge of trying to figure out what happens in billionths of a second inside of an electron or inside of a proton, or I'd say way beyond their means, their capacity. They're going where no scientist should go in terms of the strength of their conclusions. Um, when one can make the rational argument that in the functional universe, the practical universe, the proton and the electron are the only players. You don't need these extra bits to make protons and electrons, as long as you just accept their charge as being a consequence of some deeper physics, some quality they have. But the quality could be very simple in that, electrons are red checkers and protons are black checkers, and that they do something different, not the same. So I don't know, really incredibly irrelevant little piece of text here. 5 words. Does 3 hook edge smoke hookahs? Well, whatever. Does the 3? No, it's 3. I don't even know what that means. I'm going to delete it, and then if you do something stupid again, I'll just block you. God, that's irritating. I mean, you really know, you people can't take anything seriously. Just nothing. I mean, that's why this world sucks. It's because people have enough brains to write, sort of wrote words. Maybe I didn't understand it because he couldn't write the words properly. But anyway, let's just assume he has some intelligence, and this is what he does. He goes into a physics room and types absolutely incoherent mush, totally irrelevant to the points being made. I don't know. What does Trump have to do with this physics conversation? I just don't understand. It's just sorry, I just don't understand. Have you been paying any attention? I've been talking physics for the last 10 minutes at least. And this has something to do with Trump? Oh, man. You have something to do with Trump. You're an indication of why Trump got elected. It's because most people can't pay attention. They can't figure out right and wrong. They can't figure out what works, what doesn't. They can't figure out. They have no common sense. Trump was a huge failure in life, a compulsive liar demonstrated over and over and over again. I mean, obviously, he couldn't give a shit about the Bible. He just lied. Oh, it's my favorite book, except I never read it. I mean, an amazing, insane act of, well, let's put him in charge. Let's put this lunatic, this compulsive, egomaniacal lunatic in charge, who really doesn't understand anything. I mean, he doesn't even understand business because he lost more money than he made. And they elected him. So it's just kind of like physics. They just, people just keep endorsing something that's so obviously flawed, that needs so much work because it's just plain silly. Um, all right, I thought this was the men's health talk room. Okay, well, I guess now I can just block you because you're just making no sense at all. So goodbye forever, hopefully. Uh, Jeez. Oh, man. I just couldn't hate people, much more than I hate people. I mean, obviously, I guess they could do something even more hateful and more disgusting and more to embarrass themselves, and I could hate them more, but it just seems like I'm all full up on contempt for the human race. Yes. Sorry. Really shouldn't be bothering with this while I'm making a video, but I just have a hunger for it. You know, hungry for my nicotine. Um, all right. Um, all right. So one of the obvious things, as you could just say about conventional physics, is they have these two very not very good, not very compatible models of reality. So most of their models are just mathematical crap that don't really say anything about causes. So to do, say, the two slit math, you could do it with Huygens, you can do it with different mechanisms, Feynman's probability notion. Just come up with a notion to be able to load the math with essentially an angle. you know, so they call that a wave. An angle's now a wave. But anyway, um, and so there's lots of ways to get to the formula. And I would argue that much of the math is substantially effective. Some of it is clearly just approximations. You're not going to get exact numbers, because it's math over time, and math over time is obviously complicated because there's lots of little moments in time. Um, and not everything happens with just some perfect curve or, in some perfectly geometric progression through time. And so sometimes you're not going to get a clear probability, or the probability has a little bit of, you know, gray area. So math isn't always perfect, the first statement, but math isn't a model. I mean, it's such a small resolution model. I mean, it's only saying one thing about relationships between variables, that obviously a certain number of conditions go in. There's a condition, red pen and magnifying glass. And there's a condition out, which is pen is balanced on top of magnifying glass. Now, there's a mathematical formula for that, but it doesn't tell you how the pen got balanced on the magnifying glass. It doesn't tell you anything. I don't know. I mean, off topic. Why do I want to do off topic? I guess that my question is to you. I mean, you just saw me kind of pissed off because people are never on topic. I just don't understand how there is deserve if there is no free will. Deserve has to do with the mechanism. Again, it's a cause. All right. Now you can have a cause that's not flawed or broken, and you can have one that is broken. And the only argument being made, only argument I'm making is things that are broken don't deserve the rewards of function. So that's just the way it works. Um, Free will doesn't have anything to do with it. Um, and there is no such thing as a free will anyway. There's just intelligent or ignorant, or there's aware or unaware. And I would argue that people are unaware for belligerent reasons. Not by, oh, it was an accident. I didn't know I had to practice the piano to know how to play the piano. I didn't know I had to do that. Now, if somebody says to you, I didn't know I had to practice the piano to play the piano. First, do you believe them? Right? I wouldn't believe them. So clearly, the people who are assholes are often belligerently asshole. They know that it's work to be a good person or a decent person, and they don't want to do the work. And they're just making rationalizations to make asshole okay. They're saying, I will accept lower performance from myself. It's too much work to win the gold medal. So I'll make an excuse not to. And so my argument is that's deserve, in the sense that they clearly had thought patterns. Okay. The patterns clearly went through the formula, the obvious formula. Yes, one must practice to attain competency. Must one must have knowledge to be more functional. And they belligerently said, no, I don't need knowledge. I don't have to do any work. I don't have to study anything. I don't have to learn anything. I don't have to do a fucking thing except say I deserve. Now, all I'm saying is this: that asshole doesn't deserve. So, if the bad things are done are not a result of your free will, well, I'm arguing they're a result of a deliberate, belligerent will. So, whether it's free or not doesn't matter. I'm just saying it's clearly not something that deserves reward and punishment, in the sense that they don't deserve rewards for activities that should be punished. So if a society wants to get somewhere, it has to use reward and punishment. Now, obviously, deserve doesn't mean anything if there's no future, and nobody has to learn anything, and there's no um, meaning to reward and punishment. So yes, if the world's going to end tomorrow, you let all the prisoners out, because who the care? It doesn't matter. Nothing matters anymore. So there's no point in having any rules about how you apportion rewards. But it does matter how you apportion rewards in the world we exist in. Fuck you. Fuck you for changing the subject. Anyway. I mean, sorry, I just think it's so ludicrous to sit there and say, oh, they couldn't help being broken, when we know most of the people who are broken walked right past the sign. It's like walking right past the sign, no swimming, and they went swimming. That's how obvious it is. So, for us to pretend they couldn't help it, well, that doesn't make any sense. They belligerently did it, knowing better, and they just couldn't. They didn't care better. And I'm just saying that, obviously, in a world where there is going to be a tomorrow, and the people of tomorrow have to be trained by the people of today, you're not sending the right lesson. You're not teaching the right lesson if you reward assholes for being assholes, for walking right past the no swimming sign. I mean, they walk right past it. All right, so back to my theme. All right, so one of the biggest pieces of evidence of a weak theory, or a weak evidence theory. So they have two stupid models. They have Einstein's bent space, which is some sort of converging space in real terms. Can't bend it, and you have to make the space contract or disappear in some way. You have to remove space, something like that. And space is some sort of medium now, because you can make things move into space by eliminating the space. So you're essentially turning it into a medium. And then quantum mechanics, which also, in a sense, is playing a medium game where things can wave through these fields of electric and magnetic, but they're not exactly bent space fields. Now, these are just very incompatible theories. You're just, bent space, the idea of it, the contraction, doesn't really blend in any way with quantum mechanics, in the sense that it's not going to be able to provide you different ways to bend space. So then you're stuck with the electric and the magnetic bent space. And, at least you have two things, so you have some capacity to get to charge, because, charge is about two poles. But it doesn't really convert into bent space, because the mathematics doesn't add up, because the fields of the electric and magnetic are very different than the composite, if you added those two up, of gravity, because gravity is weaker, not stronger. So that doesn't make any sense. Um, so yeah, they're really not compatible physical mechanisms. So, just off the top of your head, you can say, yeah, it's really likely that one of those diagrams of reality has to be wrong. I mean, one of those theories is founded in some mistake. There's no quantum mechanics. There's just bent space, somehow quantized, and they clearly haven't been able to do that. Quantized bent space. Um, so right in the face, you can say, yeah, they've got two explanations for fundamentally, which are something has to be similar because the speed of the forces are the same, and they degrade over distance the same way by the inverse square law. There seems every indication these are something similar that has a different manifestation. So it's just a blue car versus a red car, but the fundamental car part is something they have in common. Um, and I think that's a clear argument that can be made. Um, and that the evidence supporting these theories, these foundational descriptions, that there is a medium and a wave, things wave in it, because that's essentially what both of them are, in a sense. you know, and then you have all these ether people arguing with them, which is kind of ironic, because it seems like conventional physics has already accepted the existence of some ether. They just call it virtual photon, or they call it bent space. But it's still obviously some kind of extra thing, that's not the Earth or the Sun or an asteroid. There's some other thing manipulating those things, and that thing is not a. It's not a. This is where it gets tricky, because some of these ether theorists, they actually think of the ether as particles, like water molecules. And so to me, that's a particle theory, not an ether theory. I mean, the idea to me of ether would be that it's some elemental medium, that you can't break it into little bits of sand. Because once you do that, well, then you have a whole different, it's not really ether, it's a structure. And now you're either stuck with a matrix, that is, the structure is just little stuff that, somehow is connected to the other little stuff. So you're back to atoms almost. But clearly that won't create any action, because the ether needs to provide energy. And so that's the thing they're missing usually. And so some actually do have pressurized ether, which essentially is the same as pressurized force. So once you pressurize the ether, you say it has momentum built into it, um, and you particularize it, quantize its function. That seems to me pretty much just like a ultramundane particle that we're at Lesage again. So we're it's not ether. Lesage was not considered an ether theory, as far as I know. I mean, I saw no references like that. All right. So, right. So Einstein's relativity and, this whole space-time dimension stuff, none of that stuff can be proven beyond the fact that there exists a relationship. Again, there's nothing you don't need to use Einstein's version of space-time to accept the existence of the relationship between physical material things moving and a change in their physical structure. So when this is moving, which it's doing just sitting here in gravity, it's altered by that circumstance. The physical mechanical structure is altered. The atoms are altered. They have a different weight, you could argue. Um, so if there was any function that was happening inside of those atoms, like some sort of routine, like say inside the atom, it has to bounce off this edge, get to the middle, bounce off this. Say there's some routine and I change the size of it, or I make it smaller. I obviously will change the amount of time it'll take for that routine to be performed. So the fact that there would be a relationship between speed or velocity or acceleration, how you acquire velocity, um, and an alteration in the metabolism, the function of the matter, you don't need to bend space and time to do that, to accept that the existence of that. And some of that stuff was talked about before Einstein in terms of being able to travel faster than the speed of light. And so we're really just talking about some mechanism inside of an atom that changes how fast something happens. Now, there's no real evidence that this works in any kind of way as a time teller. It just works as a way of saying that it degrades or changes how the atoms function, but there might not be any nice linear scale of degrade. So if I really do speed this up to a quarter of the speed of light, it might be that it just falls apart. Might be that it melts. Might be that all the atoms start losing their cohesion to each other, just falls apart. Might be a lot of things. And so we don't have any evidence of any of moving matter, substantial pieces of matter, anywhere near the speed of light. So, there's no real test for this idea that it ages slower. It almost sounds like it's some sort of health benefit to be accelerated, when I think, we can just intuitively kind of figure out that no, that getting accelerated like many G's or something will kill you. So that this velocity thing might not be too good for your health. So anyway, we don't have any real hard evidence. It's just weakly evidenced in that there's this general association between velocity and a degrade in how often an atom will decay, how fast it will decay, or how fast process takes place. And so we have a thin connection to that, but that's not strong evidence of a dimension of time. That in itself is just evidence that there's a relationship between velocity and a change in function, which is totally intuitively sensible. That, we can figure that out. That's not a surprise. So, but we don't need to bend space to understand that. So you can't use it as evidence of Einstein's bent space world is correct, because there's a relationship between velocity and a change in function. And that's all we have. So all we have is broken clocks. Clocks break when you move them, and they break more if you move them more. So that's all we have as evidence. And yet they're certain that this is the right theory, even though the only connection is this thin connection, and the two subjects aren't even, there's absolutely nothing that requires you to say the only person that could tell you that there's a relationship between velocity and the metabolism of the object changing is Einstein, when I could just explain it to you that if I light this flame, there's an equal but opposite reaction. Okay, there's essentially another force, the equal but opposite force, inside of this when I do that. And that's just the truth. This is happening. So all the energy going this way, there's a this way energy that's inside of this. And it's just as real as that burning flame. It's just as energetic as that. You just don't see it. It's not on fire. So it hasn't been converted into fire, hasn't been converted in something you obviously associate with energy. It's been converted into a change in the atoms inside of the object that's getting accelerated, that's absorbing the force. So I can give you a simple explanation. It explains why there's this relationship. Of course, if I put a bunch of flame inside of this, I'm going to change it, and it's not going to tell time as well if it was a clock. Okay, what's so complicated? I don't think anything's very complicated about understanding that. So there really isn't any evidence for bent space. The rest of bent space is just this obvious circumstance where you have the inverse square law, you have the speed of the force. Einstein was I think he was the first, not the first, I'm not sure. But anyway, he's one of the first people to actually just put the speed of light as the speed of gravity in the equations. and understand that the force is inductive. So that's why the speed of light would be relevant, is because the what gives something gravity is in fact a blocking, or absorbing of something that takes time to get to you. and and so time is really quite relevant to an argument about um, what an object is going to where what the how to put it um, well, clearly distance is part of the inverse square law, and understanding that the force doesn't travel instantaneously means that somewhere in this a relationship between two objects, their timing, that is, when they're feeling something and when they're reacting to it, the reaction times are not instantaneous, kind of obviously. Just like in an electric circuit, the speed of light creates the opportunity for things to get out of phase because one object can't react to what the other object did until it actually knows something changed. And the information is carried on this force. Um, and so the time it takes for the force to actually affect something, it can't react until it knows of the action is the point. So the speed of light is relevant. Um, and then I think the rest of the equation is just recognizing that the sun, center of gravity, is also moving. It's processing. It's doing this kind of thing as over time. It's not in one solid place and everything else is moving. And so that explains Mercury's precession, is because the sun's precessing. So the sun's precession is essentially mirrored in the precession of Mercury. And the rest of it is just figuring out all these little tiny details. But again, so let's understand it's the tiniest bit of improvement to Newton's general argument. So this is really just talking about the tiny influences on these material bodies in this gravitational math. And so, yes, it's more accurate, but it's a tiny amount of the function. And so again, but this huge recognition that somehow Einstein, you need bent space somehow to be able to acknowledge something like the sun processing or light taking time to get from one place to another. You don't need bent space. You don't need to combine, you don't need to create a time dimension to explain, the fact that there can be these nuances to the function that mean that you have to account for them if you want to do really exact math. All right, so that's Einstein's part, which I'd say, again, just incredibly weakly evidenced as any kind of model. It first isn't even a model. It's just kind of a God theory in the sense it just basically says the magical thing contracts the space. There's some magical mechanism. Oh, there's so many ways to argue this. There's another one I thought of was another obvious hole in the bent space argument is the fact that there isn't the strongest gravity isn't in the center of something. It clearly is on the surface, the strongest gravity, because you have the longest diagonal line. And that's what's really creating the gravity, is the thickness of the material, how much material is on a line. That'll tell you how much gravity there's going to be on that surface. And we'd really see it if we had oddly shaped, if gravity didn't force the Earth into a sphere, you'd feel the extra gravity, where the big lumpy parts were, where there would be a longer diameter. And all of a sudden, this idea that space is getting contracted maybe wouldn't make so much sense because there's no center engine to do the contraction. So just understand, the gravity's nothing here in the middle. That's a problem, I think, for some contracting theory. Because how does a collection of little atoms contract in such a way as to give you the illusion the contraction is coming from the center. It doesn't sound very plausible. And it seems to make more sense, like I said, that you would understand that it just has to do with density, how much mass in how small an area will tell you how much gravity you have or you're creating. All right. So, all right. So then quantum mechanics. So let's move on to quantum mechanics. So I'm just saying very weakly evidence theory that there's any connection between, that there's anything called the time dimension. The time is anything other than just a function. And it takes a certain amount of time for things to happen. And you can't make the things happen faster or slower than the force will allow them to happen. You can't make light go faster. You can't make light go slower. It doesn't do those things. And there's no dimension you can warp. There's no way you can change time. You can only change metabolism. Like I said, if I make this, I do this motion, and I make it take twice as long to do that. That is, I make myself have to do it slower. Quite obviously, it's going to take me longer to get through my day. So if everything takes longer, it doesn't mean I live a longer day. It just means that I do fewer things in one day. And that's sort of the implications of time dilation. It's not going to make you live 10,000 years. It's just going to make you live the same amount of time. And you're just going to understand a hell of a lot less because you're not seeing the universe at full resolution. You're only getting half the pixels, so to speak. All right, so another off subject comment. Insofar as we can still arrange social contract rules that reward and deter behavior, I think it's fine to say that deserve proportional what you contribute. Yes, exactly. I mean, quite obviously, we have to reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. And it doesn't matter what causes the good or bad behavior. It just doesn't matter. We have to punish something. It just logically makes sense that if we have to punish something, we punish the guilty. I mean, sure, why not? Okay, yes, they're not really guilty. They didn't know they're not supposed to walk past no swimming signs. They didn't know they're not supposed to whack people over the head with a brick. You know, doesn't matter. Okay, if we have to punish somebody, because we have to do something to deter the behavior. It just makes sense that if you want to deter the behavior, if you punish some innocent 5-year-old, you just say, okay, you're going to jail for 100 years because he killed somebody. That wouldn't make any sense because it's not connected to the action. You see, the reward and the punishment has to be connected to, logically connected. So you have to punish the guilty. You just really don't have a choice because reward and punishment can only work that way. All right. All right. So, I mean, you want to get a room. I mean, if you want to, like I said, if you want to talk, whatever that is, I don't even know if it's ethics, then go do it somewhere else. Then you have to make up laws till everyone is punished. I mean, does that make any sense? LOL. Then you have to make up laws till everyone is punished. What does that have to do with this conversation? You insane fuck. I just don't understand what that could possibly mean. You're smart enough to recognize that you shouldn't hit people over the head with bricks. So you pass a law that says you can't hit people over the head with bricks. Then you punish people who you catch on videotape hitting somebody else over the head with a brick. Now, why do I have to do anything after that? Why haven't I finished my job here, which is to deter people from hitting other people over the head with bricks? Stupid. People are just so fucking dumb. All right, so the weak evidence for quantum mechanics. Let's get to that one because it's just as bad. So what quantum mechanics has done is basically just converted a a theory of interaction. An interaction happens. You send light through a small opening. You send light into a piece of glass, and there's going to be an event. The light is going to interact with the structure, and the truth is that the structure is, and the consequence of that interaction is going to be that different things can happen. Okay, that the light can reflect off the glass, or the light can go into the glass. And what happens probabilistically, you can dissect it into a circumstance that is somehow dependent on how thick the glass is. That'll tell you what the likelihood of the photon reflecting or not reflecting. And if I change the size of the slit, I can change the likelihood of a particular angle of deflection. So you have a simple circumstance. An interaction first is required. That is, photon close to the surface of something. That's what making a surface small does, is it makes it more probable that you're going to have an interaction close to the surface of the material. The smaller the opening, the more likely you've traveled very close to the material. And so a clear, obvious relationship between the little thing and the material stuff together, creating an outcome. And they've converted that into, no, it's just a little bit. And somehow he has some notion that he doesn't know where he is. And somehow when you try to confine him, that is to find out where he is, he rejects it by going wacky. In this probabilistic way, though. He goes wacky in a very specific way. Very proportional. So you have pretty simple cause and effect in the sense that okay, there's only two elements to this thing, really. There's the thing you're interacting with, and there's the thing you're using to interact with it, the photon or the electron or whatever. And that's all you have, right? This is a simple thing, a simple equation. And they've made it into this very complex thing where we have to create new universes. We have to give photons all kinds of special power that they don't have. When you could just say there's a cause and effect here. There's something in the circumstance that's causing the effect. Something's like this, a pyramid, right? I could hit the pyramid right on the point. I could hit the pyramid on the slope. I could hit the flat part. I mean, there's different things I can do, and I'll have a different result based on which one I do, and it'll be probabilistic. The point of the pyramid's a tiny percentage of the pyramid, right? The slope of the pyramid's another percentage, and the flat part could be another percentage, and that's really going to dictate what's going to happen to that photon, or rock, or whatever. All right, so let's see what this guy says. Then you don't like people say, then you make law they can't say, but what you like or they must be punished them. It's the truth, chaos behind order. Fuck you. What is it? What is that nonsense? Obviously, I can almost say anything I want in these videos. I mean, I can't tell people to go out and molest kids or something, or do something insanely stupid. But what the fuck are you even talking about, jackass? And even if we lived in some Nazi-esque society that was creating all kinds of fascist law that didn't have anything to do with the right thing, what the fuck, okay, would that have to do with the simple principle that reward and punishment doesn't work if you punish the innocent? Stupid jackass. Oh, fuck. All right, if you cover one slit, then some dark bands go away. Again, this isn't you say, okay? First, you say, because this covering one slit thing is a whole nother complex idea, all right? These are very small slits, by the way. So you have to make the slit go away in a sense without somehow changing the molecular static charge, the whole thing. I mean, we know that the edge of this matter is a something, right? Your argument is if I put my finger right next to this, I somehow didn't affect this at all. That I could have my finger anywhere around on this paper. I could move it all over the place, and I'm not affecting the edge of this paper at all. Do you think that's really how matter works? Do you really think that's how charge works? Do you think the surface of stuff is that unaffected by what you're moving in and out of proximity to it? So first off, you don't have any experimental proof of what you just said. So show me the experiment, because the one experiment I've seen where they actually put a barrier in front of, you can see that the patterns, you can see a substantial amount of the fact that the patterns are combinations of each other, because when they moving into one, you can see there's still a combination pattern, and you always see some percentage of the original pattern is always in both patterns, when you're moving in and moving out. So again, you're just saying this is an established fact when it's not really. And then you say something as stupid as this. So this is the funny part. It's not complicated. Copenhagen isn't complicated. Many worlds isn't complicated. Sounds pretty complicated to me. But these religious fanatics will continue arguing. Schmidt. You cover one slit and you still have the single slit experiment. Now the problem is you're not shooting the light through the middle of the slit. So first off, that's a slight problem, but you have a problem. So you have to make sure what kind of light you're putting through. Laser beams work pretty good because the light's kind of coherent across the whole area. But if you're using bode light, which a lot of people do, because they create a aperture to send the light through to diverge it. So they're almost deliberately bulging the light. So obviously that light would be affected. Anyway, I thought I was agreeing with you. Maybe you need a cup of coffee. No, I don't see how there's any agreement in this statement you made. If you cover one slit, then some dark bands go away. No, if you cover one slit, you're stuck with the single slit experiment. And the two patterns are different. They're not composites of each other. So there clearly something changes in the material circumstance when you start covering. And a key word here is not just covering, that is not blocking the light getting to the target, is different than actually removing a slit. So again, you have to kind of, this is happening on the scale of photons, the smallest thing in the universe. I mean, you really can't pretend that you've eliminated a slit by merely obscuring its vision. This hand doesn't go away if I put this hand in front of it. This hand is still here. If you cover one slit, the dark bands, you're saying the same thing again. So that's the single slit experiment. That's what I said. But it's not that simple. You don't just cover, you don't take the two slit pattern, cover one of the slits and end up with just half the pattern or something, or some dark bands go away. That's not what happens. They're completely realigned. Where the light and dark is in completely different places. Oh, Jesus. See, it's just too deep. It's a complex. These subjects are always a little bit complex. There's always nuances to them. And so that's the real problem with arguing this stuff is, you have to be aware of all the nuance. And no one's going to check conventional science on all that minutia. But the minutia is important, like the minutia of the whole idea of an interferometer and how you create two equal beams of light, and whether any of the mechanisms they're using to create these two beams of light create equal beams of light. When I would argue clearly they can't do that. They're not designed to do that by design. Well, I'm sorry, you're just wrong, Al. Okay, the pattern changes. entirely. The amount of light in different locations changes. So you can't just say bands go away, because that's not what happens. All right, I'll just block you if you want to, Adam Sky. I've done experiments right on my own porch. So, you want to just keep lying. And what did they do in the 50s? Exactly. What's your argument that where did they do where's the brilliant experiment from the 50s? Brilliantly relevant. I think you know it by their energy level. Um, the amount of, you know, takes a lot of photons to move something. A lot of photons. I mean, you have to hit it with a lot of photons. So I think that's how you know. Everything that moves the speed of light, frankly, is the same size, in my opinion. And it's all really, really small. And it's, yes, the smallest stuff in the universe. Only small stuff can move the speed of light. Only. Only. And I just mean small by how much energy it takes to move something. I mean, obviously, it takes a lot of energy to move this. Just duh, it takes a lot of energy to move this from one place to another. A lot. I mean, a lot from, the standard of how many photons it would take. So anyway, back to quantum mechanics and its weaknesses. All right, so look, what you're basically having quantum mechanics is mathematics, and like I said before many times, a lot of the math isn't all that bad, but the math isn't. They do they preload the math with a bunch of assumptions. So in the case of the two slit experiment, they start talking about Heisenberg and Huygens and creating a mechanism to create wave interference, when which all you really have in the math is an angle. So all you're really doing is changing the angle. So nothing else is really happening. There's just an angle change. Okay, that's proportional. That is, it's it's just multiples. So it's 3 degrees, 6 degrees, 9 degrees, 12 degrees. It's always the same proportional change in the angle. And that's all you really have. And they have this whole theory that everything is made out of waves, and somehow waves are interfering. So somehow photons convert from something that waves through the universe in a straight line, just like a bullet, into something that's not anything like a bullet at all, that's some spready thing that interferes with itself and then converts back into a bullet. When, the sensible argument is it's just a change in the direction. I mean, you just took the bullet and you made it bend, and then you bent it more, and then you bent it more. But that's all you did. You just changed the angle, but the bullet is moving. And that explains it. You don't need all this other crap to explain it. You can just stick with your corpuscle and just say what's bending the bullet. And so there's an obvious connection between the atoms of the material and how close you are to them and how much the bullet bends. There seems this obvious connection. I make the hole smaller, more bending. Make the hole bigger, less bending. Seems kind of like there's an obvious connection between getting close to the surface and being bent more. So you don't need any wave theory. I don't even know what else to off the top of my head to cite as quantum mechanics, but I mean, really, it's just converting everything into waves when it's not really waves, it's just vectors. And the same thing happens in magnetism and everything else. There's no waves coming out of a magnet. There's no blah, 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 waves. Okay, the magnet is just producing rays of force, lines of force, uh, and at angles. And it's, it does so proportionally by the inverse square law, by the same rules of a light bulb. Um, And I say light bulb as if it's a good example, because to me it's just so logical. Because, but I don't, you people, apparently there's some people who look at a light bulb and they see waves coming off of it, you know, where I only ever in my whole life could ever see rays coming off of it. It never made any sense to think about there's waves of light coming off of it, these vibrations. No, they're bullets being fired, and some of the bullets hit my eye on a straight line, and then some bullets hit over here. They're way over here. Some bullets are over here hitting, just little bullets hitting in different locations. And the closer you are, the more bullets that hit. The further away you are, the less bullets that hit. Yeah, makes perfect sense. And the light goes forever. It doesn't deteriorate in any sense. It just gets fewer bullets. You go further away, the bullets are still just as strong. They're just fewer of them. And that perfectly fits with the experimental evidence. And yet, there's some other perception, and I would argue again, just profoundly weakly evidenced. And you can see the flaws in the double slit experiment in terms of how I pointed out how the math doesn't even fit the actual results, in the sense that the experiment, when you do it with photons, doesn't create a wave of gradation on off in a very smooth way. It creates very barry looking patterns that don't have anything to do with that. How do you know photons are okay? Build all the technology that we use today. I think you have good ideas, but like to argue so you don't get to your full potential. Well, fuck you. Make a device you can show people and call that proof. Again, you can't prove. These are basic, fundamental. You're explaining. You're arguing causes, shithead, not effects. You're not going to create an anti-gravity gun or something. You're not going to. There's no special way that I prove my physics right, because my physics has to do with causes, not effects. We know what the effects are, for fuck's sake. That's the reliable part, is the effect. The argument is about what's causing the effect. They say dark matter gods are doing it, and bent space gods are doing it, and the invisible wave function, blah, blah, probabilistic thingy is doing it. I'm arguing that no, there's a physical universe, and that physical little bits are doing it, moving the speed of light. And that they're, by just creating two kinds of them, two polarizations, electron polarization and proton polarization, then you can account for magnetism and the strong force and everything. So you can unify physics by just recognizing that, no, it's little force bits, and there's two kinds of force, two kinds of matter, and they interact in exactly an opposite manner, which creates the ability to have strong attraction and strong repulsion. Very simple. Anyway. You are drunk, go home. Yeah, something like that. Could I don't know what that is, cavation, cause the slit experiment? I don't know what a ventricavitation is, but I doubt it. So that's just more wavy crap, more turbulence. There's turbulence in the ether, and because the photon is spinning this way and he's hyperboloiding that way, and it's and so you're just back to giving everything all these complex features. And why do I don't need a complex feature? It's not doing anything that complicated. The bullet is just bending. It's just hitting. It's just changing the angle that it goes at. And when it goes into a piece of glass, like Newton's glass experiments that Feynman went over, all it's doing is changing the probability from 4% to 6% to 8% to 12% to 16%. That's all. There's just a change. I mean, a simple change. You don't need all this complex explanation. A simple explanation. The thing you're hitting has a shape. If you hit this part of the shape, you're in the 4%. You hit this part, it's the 6%. You hit this part, it's the 8%. I mean, shit. Let's see. Star Wars laser sword should be projecting out cones, not rods. I don't know why a laser would do a cone, but whatever. Who cares? Even Crazy Ken is making optic magnet toys. Well, I'm not in that business. He has the power to tell people whatever. I don't know what that even means. but obviously that's cartoon physics. His physics is a cartoon. It's imbecilically, irrationally, just a bunch of vocabulary. He doesn't have any physical model. He can't draw you magnets attracting. He can't draw you magnets repelling because his theory doesn't make any fucking sense. Yeah, pressure in what is the point though? Pressure change causes cavitation. So what? I don't even know if it's really pressure changes. I mean, it's obviously movement that causes it, and the movement creates changes in pressure that have to move through the fluid. So again, you're just back to some ether that I don't need. I don't need to create an ether. And we clearly know that photons aren't affected by you can crash photons right into each other and they don't even care. So I mean, what medium is getting cavitated by the photons? It's just whatever. It's hopeless. It's just too stupid. When selling anything, I'm not really selling anything. So I mean, this is just such a stupid premise for a statement to me. This is an argument about the truth. All right. It doesn't really have anything to do with selling anything. It just has to do with a simple thing like it took place a couple hundred years ago when Darwin presented a theory of evolution. And he had this well evidenced theory for the existence of things. And then he had this silly notion that a God poofed it. And I'm just saying all that's all you want is to people to do the argument. And most intelligent people could get it. The funny part is that intelligent people are obnoxious to letting go of their physics dogmas. Anyway, even better to have to market it, and a device, no matter how simple, gives them the marketing power. Again, this is not, I'm not playing that. Okay. You can keep saying the only way you can do physics is you have to have a particle accelerator and find the magical double God particle. And then you can prove them wrong because you found the magical double God particle. No, I'm not, homie, don't play that in the first place. But that has absolutely nothing to do with this conversation. It really just doesn't. The I'm putting their physics on trial in the sense that the trial they did was so bad. They have no evidence really to defend their conviction, to say we know the truth. They don't know the truth. They have a vague image of it, and there's a better resolution image, in my opinion, that can be constructed. Let's see, I was just thinking of the beam sword as a single slit because the laser comes out flush from the handle. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I'm just saying, obviously, you can use a lens and correct any aberration in the laser, but obviously, if you have enough, they're kind of a big beam, and so the quantum effects are going to be very small. So, yes, it's creating a double slit pattern, I mean, a single slit pattern. It's creating some Newton's rings, but the Newton ring part is such a tiny percentage of the entire amount of light that goes through the laser. Such a tiny percentage of the light hits the surface that the effect is invisible. Photon reacting to pressure change. Well, I'm just not interested. Okay, pressure change in what? The pressure of the what? Of the ether? The ether made of what? The ether that somehow knows when to make a photon spread and when to make a photon go straight. You know, the magic ether. It's just useless drivel. Whatever. People are just forget it. It's just no point. But there's no other alternative, unfortunately. Like reward and punishment, there's just no alternative. All right, some of them are very different. Um, Similar forces, very different models. I think I said. I don't know. But obviously, there's a common threads here of the speed that these things are transmitted at, and that gives a huge incentive, in my opinion, to recognize that these things wouldn't just accidentally have the same speed. Bent space has the same speed as virtual photons just by accident. You know, I don't think so. So I think they've clearly got to be a similar mechanism. And that's why their model is no good, is because you can't convert quantum mechanics into gravity, and you can't convert gravity as a foundation. Is you can't do all this wavy interference bullshit. All right. Well, I've probably done all I can do, and the commenters aren't close enough to being on the subject. So, I mean, you're supposed to do 2 hours, but I'm not doing 2 hours of frustrated conversation about irrelevant points. Where the only point that I think needs to be conceded is they have a weakly evidenced model, and that if they go back and relook at cause again, they might be able to find a cause that actually fits both the phenomenon on the very small scale and the phenomenon on the big scale, where their current models aren't compatible. They have separated the big universe from the small universe. It's early morning, for fuck's sake. Yeah, well, it's mid morning here. I mean, it's 11 o'clock. It's what it is. 11:08. And, it's a sunny day and it's nice and hot and my kind of weather. And yeah, I don't want to be trapped here with you idiots. I mean, I just need a physicist to argue with. I got to find one who's willing to get paid, um, to argue, because this is, arguing with you chuckleheads just doesn't do it. So anyway, I don't think there's anything else. Particle physics. Yeah, it's just funny how particle physics really isn't about particles anymore. The anti-particle. It's all gotten so bizarrely silly. Well, I wasn't asking Piro to make a model at all, so I don't have to get Piro to do something. He offered to do something that I think is too complicated for him to do, so I just pointed out that I don't know how you can model, you know, especially in 3D, um, something you don't even understand. I mean, you have to sort of understand the model before you can model it in a computer. What would a physicist say about the slit experiment? Well, they'd either be a believer in the Feynman interpretation, or they would be stuck with Copenhagen or many worlds or some other kind of wacky notion about the magic, and that's easy to fight. They have all the same data you do. Well, again, they have conclusions about what we see happen, but that's not under dispute. I'm not disputing the existence of the double slit pattern. I'm disputing the fact that it's at all remarkable considering the single slit pattern. The single slit pattern is the remarkable one. That's the one. Wow, what the fuck? And the single surface pattern. Look, it even happens on surfaces. Okay, I mean, don't be fooled. A single surface creates an interference pattern. A single surface does it. What would a physicist say if I say, well, what about the single surface interference pattern? How's your theory account for that? How's that a Heisenberg measurement or something? Um, so fuck you. They have all the same data you do. Don't you think if one was smart enough to get your ideas, they'd have thought of it before? Well, you could say that about everybody who's ever had an idea. So why didn't somebody think of Einstein's idea 100 years earlier? But the truth is, some guy did 300 years ago talk about particle gravity. And they basically just mocked him out of existence over time because of one problem, one substantial problem. That was the drag problem. So instead of trying to figure out why there isn't drag, because we know there isn't, instead of doing that, they just said, well, that's it. Your theory sucks. And that's it. So I'm just saying the model fits so perfectly. They call it mock gravity because it mocks gravity so well. It does gravity great. So I'm just saying that that's the history. You know, you want to pretend the history is something else. Okay, go ahead and pretend. No, and Einstein got on the headlines of the paper, okay, for an experiment that has no efficacy. That's junk, essentially a junk experiment, the Eddington experiment. It proves nothing. I mean, you know, this is such bullshit. Um, you say no ether when what is it? Space, empty space. That's right. There's nothing and there's something. So there's something bits, bullets, and then there's the nothing they're traveling through. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And then there's other bullets, and then there's other mechanisms. So you have mechanisms, things, and you have little bits bouncing because you have ping pong paddles and you have little ping pong balls bouncing between them. Nothing else is real. So the only thing that's real are ping pong paddles and little balls bouncing between them. That's it. There's no other real stuff in the universe. Shit. Let's see. Try him and work with him to get it right. Build it on a shared server so you have the master. Yeah, well, whatever. I'm not really worried about that part. But no, I can't work with Piro. It's impossible. But whatever. So what this other crap? How did I get this far back? I hate this fucking thing. All right. Most researchers agree that the single slit interference in Newton's rings are not true interference. Oh, well, that's just hilarious then. So where do you get this from, most researchers? Because I'd love to hear what kind of crap they say. Because I can quote you Professor Lewin from MIT, who said this isn't diffraction and this is interference. He says explicitly it's the same thing. The same mechanism is creating both these patterns. There's no way of getting around it. So, I mean, I can give you plenty of quotes from lecturers and physicists and doctors of physics. So I don't know what most researchers are. Anyway, it is not true interference, but instead micrometer gaps in the classical imperfect machine build of the slit itself. Well, that's just silly. I mean, you can't make that argument rationally that the surfaces of the single slit are more defective than the surfaces on the double slit. I mean, it's certainly not because there's little lumps in the pad on the surface. I mean, little lumps that aren't molecular lumps. I would argue that there are molecular lumps, but there's no lumps, quote unquote, that are causing the pattern. The nothing has electron, don't it? No, electrons aren't nothing. Electrons are something. Electrons are ping pong balls. The stuff between ping pong balls would be nothing. Oh, amazing. I don't get why you think sitting down with physicists, and again, I wouldn't sit with them, would be productive because I could challenge them and show how they don't have evidence. I could force the physicists to admit their evidence is weak when they're too dumb to get it. Now, I don't think they're too dumb to get it. They're too religious to get it. I think you tried to spin my words around. Not sure why. I don't try to spin anything, asswipe. Uh, got to be electric, whatever. A nothing statement. Nothing. A meaningless statement. Got to be electric. Doesn't mean anything. Electric what? What the fuck do you think an electric is, asshole? You don't have any clue what an electric is. I mean, I can explain electric to you. It's very simple. The ping pong paddles. Ping pong paddles are the electrons. So let's say these are both the same color. And there's little force bits, photons, you know, stuff moving the speed of light, bouncing back and forth between them as they reflect off the electrons. So let's say these pens were both black, and there's a little black ball that just reflects back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now, if it was a red ball, it would hit and come out perpendicularly, so it couldn't get stuck. But it's black, it gets stuck between the two ping pong balls. Now, if I move the paddles, the electrons, closer together, that is, increase the pressure. So now instead of space, like say the electrons start off this far away, then you can only have two electrons in a foot. But if I move the paddles this close, then you can have a whole bunch of electrons in a foot, and the pressure between them is really high. And the ping pong ball is going really fast because it's bouncing, bounce, bounce, bounce. So it's hitting a lot. That is the pressure of voltage, and that's the pressure. When you increase the voltage, you could create a gamma ray or an X-ray. You can create very high frequency energy, because if one of these things, big ping pong balls, escapes, it's going to have the high energy frequency. They're going to be very close to each other. Idiot. All right. Electric reaction in photons. That doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's just you take the pacifier out of your mouth and try typing it again? That's infantile gibberish. Electric reaction in photons. what is that crap? What could that possibly mean to an intelligent person? Yeah. I'm just saying it's a simple physical model. I mean, if you can't see how simple this physical model is, I mean, ping pong balls, paddles, reflections. It's so simple, but yes, it explains why there's frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum, and why there's a tight relationship between the amount of pressure and the smallness of the frequency. That relationship is perfectly explained by recognizing that light and the rest of the electromagnetic spectrum is actually the force between electrons. And then you compress electrons, you make the force a higher frequency force. It's so freaking obvious. Some of your theory is weirdly, and whatever this even means, weirdly an interpretation. I mean, that doesn't even say anything. It's not a counter argument to a single fucking thing I said. Why don't you quote the part of my theory that seems weirdly an interpretation? Fucking A. It's where you try to provide non-evidenced alternatives. Again, I'm consistent with the evidence. I just explained why photons have a frequency. Is because they're trapped between the electrons, and the electrons get closer together. They change the frequency based on how far apart they are. Holy fuck. I mean, radio waves is a little different, but I won't get to that right now. But it's the same mechanism. The same process causes the effect. And it explains what voltage is. Oh, God. If it were to try to provide non-evidenced alternatives, it's where you try to provide non-evidence. So again, I have evidence. The evidence is consistent with the experiments that exist. Alternatives to explain what we already know. So you know something. What do you know? Light is a wave. You know that. And you know it why. Through the current paradigm, the current dogma, the current assumptions. And that's all they are, is fucking assumptions. But this is done while you bash. Well, obviously you have to bash. If I think the king is no good, I'm going to overthrow the king. There has to be a reason why I'm overthrowing him. He has to be dysfunctional in some specific way that I claim I can do the job better. Yes, I'm claiming your paradigm is rubbish, that these answers to problems are laughably um, pitiful. Dark matter as an explanation. It's a pitiful explanation. I mean, it's so God of the fucking gap bullshit. Let's just invent fake matter that only does one thing that regular matter does, the one thing we need, and it doesn't do anything that we don't need. Now, isn't that just too fucking convenient? I mean, oh, jeez. Explain radio waves. I get the photon bounce part. Well, radio waves have to do with the energy comes in bulk. So it really doesn't have to do with rays as much anymore. It just has to do with vibration. So you have a billion photons hit something, and then a billion photons hit it, and they're hitting it at a frequency. So the the effect is that the change in the electrons is happening to all the electrons in the composite, the thing absorbing it. That means the usually piece of metal, because it has to be a conductor, and it's just pressurizing all of the electrons for a brief moment, um, and creating a voltage. Now, to produce the radio wave, you're just reversing that process. So you're pushing a lot of current into the piece of metal. You're expanding, that is moving the electrons, and you're doing it essentially, let me see how to, you're doing it all at once. So you're just creating a bunch of individual little bits. So you're not releasing your, to have a frequency. So if I have two ping pong paddles, when they're close, I have to have two leave for you to see the frequency, right? So the frequency they're bouncing at, you can't see the frequency if just one leaves. But if two leave, or three, or four, then you can see the how close these two paddles are. But you can't see it unless more than one leaves. But for radio waves, just one of them has to leave, because it's a composite of all of the electrons are doing the same thing. So every atom is doing the same thing. It's releasing one little bit. So they're releasing little bits all at once, and then waiting a while, and then releasing a bunch of little bits. So they're just creating the frequency in a kind of a different mechanism. So they're not creating long enough rays for it to be true electromagnetic spectrum. So it really doesn't have to do with the distance. It just has to do with the fact that you're disturbing the electrons, which releases a bit. You're moving the paddles, so something leaves. I mean, there's a subtle difference in how the two are created, is the point. And you can sort of get that. You can sort of get how they're different because of how different they are in their function, and what you can do with, visible light versus what you can do with a radio wave. They're really different in terms of what you can do with them. All right. I agree with you, but how to prove it in an experiment? So again, you just keep saying the same shit over and over and over again. I can only prove their interpretations are wrong. So I can do the radio wave experiment, where they say they create interference with two radio beams that interfere with each other. That experiment can be done, and it can prove that it's not interference, that the same amount of energy goes to all locations, and that all they're doing is jamming the frequency. So when they send the same signal to a location that has different distances and it's out of phase, well, then you've changed the frequency. Then you have, instead of this frequency, you've created this frequency, and you're repeating that. And so you're not tuned to that frequency, so you don't hear it. Because to tune in frequencies, you have to tune them in. But if you just measure the energy that comes to the antenna, so you just measure the voltage that comes to the antenna, you'll see that the voltage is the same everywhere. No differences, because you're not jamming the signal. Now, that's something I can prove. Now, once I prove that, Am I going to get any reward for it by proving that there is no wave interference in radar? There's no wave interference in radio signals? Because I think it can be proven. Let's see. So yeah, it's just coming up with these kind of experiments that debunk their experiments. So you just have to come up with ways of doing their experiments to prove them wrong. I did the interferometer thing with a plain piece of glass. I demonstrated that a plain piece of glass appears to bend light at a pretty close to 50-50, okay? And that if I put any dirt on the glass, then I get the rings. So all I have to do is put dirt on a plain piece of glass, and I can create rings. I can create the interferometer pattern without any interference, without any beams combining, none of that crap necessary. I'm just saying that's all I can do. All I can do is demonstrate how their interpretations of experiments is fundamentally flawed. But I've already pointed out the logic being flawed. The very idea of a half-silvered mirror, it should have occurred to somebody that you can't half-silver the mirror. It can't work because all the little pieces of silver are going to create little diffraction gradients. They're going to create little slits that are going to make the light spread. So how could your two beams be the same if one beam is spreading and the other beam isn't? I mean, I've done this. I mean, you know, sit there and tell me what I have to do when I've already done it. Let's see. I agree. Okay. So it's a bulk unit of photons and pulses like a shotgun, not a machine gun. Well, that's one comparison. I'm just saying the mechanism is subtly different, so you can't use another gun analogy because they're not really being shot in the gun fashion. It's like the bullets, you know, I don't know. I mean, in one case, the bullets are being thrown. In one case, the bullets are being shot. So just I'm just being fair. The fair analysis is that the mechanism is the same, but the difference is more substantial than, I guess, just the difference between pulling the trigger fast or pulling the trigger slow. And shotgun just implies that it's almost a backwards analogy, but shotgun implies that you can shoot a bunch of these things. Let's see how to say it. Well, all right, I'll just let this slide. Yes, that's close enough. Okay, that's what I should have said. Close enough. Do you have evidence that your model with the paddles and ping pong balls is more accurate than the accepted model? Well, the evidence is that it fits everything. It unifies physics, so that's key. It explains gravity, magnetism, electricity, and the nuclear forces. It explains the function of protons, neutrons, and electrons in atoms. So yeah, that's part of the evidence for my model being right, is that it explains a lot more stuff. Does your model explain any real-life observations of traditional physics cannot? Well, name me one of the things they can't explain, because it seems to me they have a made-up explanation for everything. So you tell me what they can't explain, and I'll tell you that certainly I can, yes. Because my physics works everywhere, theirs works nowhere. For every spectrum, there's an equal opposite spectrum. That's just a nonsensical rubbish. How do you do the opposite of 300 nanometers? What are you, fucking retarded? It's just silly jargon. Just silly. I just don't think experiment's going to do it. I mean, if you don't understand, like I said, if I prove the radar experiment to be a fraud in the sense that they've included as interference when it's obviously not, they'll just say, "Oh yeah, okay, we made a mistake. That's not included in interference." But that doesn't change what happens to photons. You know, they're not gonna sit there and say you're right. But clearly, there's every reason to believe I'm right, and there's every reason to believe that they know I'm right in the sense that they always do the experiment by putting an audio signal on the frequency. So they always make it frequency dependent. So there's no way they can tune the actual energy. They're not looking for the actual energy. They're trying to make it fit. And it's a deliberate effort to make it fit by putting the stupid sound carrier on. I think you need to have more mindful panel where it's a planned and people can come in with a list of questions, well, yeah, that'd be very nice. That's where I'm trying to head for. But I mean, I really want to find a physicist to argue with, not one of you, sorry, fake doctors. you know, you get mad at improv questions on your show that generates physics outside of your own theory. Well, I don't even know what that means, but clearly I have one mission here, and that is to contrast my theory against conventional physics. I really don't need to contrast it against tinfoil hat physics. Well, it's nice that you call yourself a scientist. I mean, what do you have a degree in? And apparently, from what I've read, it should be easily done. You should think of it as after the truth. I don't even know what that means. Going a while sounds like perfect sense. Why do you think no one steps to the plate and put you in your place if that's the case? Right. If I'm wrong, why not prove me wrong? Especially when I've offered them money. I have offered real money. So let's not play around here. I've offered people $5,000. Okay. The talking, some of the famous talking heads, $5,000 for 4 hours work. I've asked them to do 4 hours work for $5,000. And apparently, from what I've read, you should be easily done. You should think all of as are after the truth. I don't know what that means, but okay. Negative, positive spectrum. We observe only one. Well, whatever. You're just talking gibberish, Jesse. This has no value. This is Ken Wheeler jargon. Negative, positive spectrum. What does that even mean? It's just silly. You have a degree in women's studies. Yeah, that's funny. But it doesn't really answer the question, Mr. Scientist. Yeah, well, Gary doesn't have a degree, but I'm just saying if somebody's going to show up and say, they know their shit, they have to demonstrate something to know their shit. They can tell me, look, I've watched, physics lectures for the last 10 years of my life, and that's where I've acquired some knowledge, and I'm ready to take you on because I think their crap is beautiful crap. I don't mind that. I'm just saying, but I need to humiliate a proper physicist. Because I think it's easy to do. I mean, they don't know the truth. Most of them, they never really analyzed the history, right? Right. I mean, again, the young experiment is such a load of crap in the context of Newton's rings 150 years earlier. So Newton already discovers small apertures create diffraction patterns, which he didn't call interference. He just called them diffraction patterns. And so it's already a known. And all of a sudden, Young shows up 150 years later, and everybody forgets that Newton already did this, that we already know that apertures, little slits, create pattern. Because there was nothing, Young didn't discover the fact that the pattern is inside the envelope of the single slit pattern. So he didn't understand any of the nuance. So Young's contribution wasn't the nuanced part because he didn't even know it existed. And his experiment was so crude. It was done with sunlight. It wasn't even monochromatic light. And it was done like with a cardboard box outside. Well, a wooden box outside. I mean, not a very sophisticated experiment. And yet everybody talks about Young like this was a revealing moment in physics history. And it's preposterously insignificant if you know about Newton's rings. If you know about Newton's rings, Young's experiment is unremarkable, completely unremarkable. And the fact that Einstein and Bohr and all these people would talk about it like it's a remarkable experiment when, you know, well, at least they weren't around in 1805. So they were doing it as if it was history. So again, but the fact that they just didn't talk about single slit and then talk about single surface, because that's when the conversation really gets interesting. How does the single surface do it? how do you explain Newton's rings? Electrons. Sorry, I'm late to this party, and this is my first time hearing you talk about this. Well, I would suggest you go to my channel page, and there's videos in playlists, two categories, questions and overview. So watch at least one of the overview videos, and then watch at least one of the question videos, and then maybe start talking to me. you know, because I've been over some of this stuff so many times. What's your idea on how the frequencies form the structure? I don't know what's the frequencies. By the way, I don't know what the frequencies are. And the structure is merely the angle. So again, I'm clearly pointing out that the electron's a big thing, the photon's a small thing. Photon hits the electron moves, and then it moves back. When it moves back, that's when the new photon is released at the new angle, and the moving back angle is different than the moving out angle. So when the electron is perturbated, disturbed, the electron moves in a pattern like this. So it comes back with a different momentum angle than it left with, and it releases the photon, the new photon, at that angle. And so if you hit one electron, you go 3 degrees. You hit two electrons, you go 6 degrees. You hit three electrons, you go 9, 12, blah, blah, blah. Let's see. Oh, quantum erasers, more bullshit. There's no quantum erasure experiment. This is just all such a crock of shit. Um, it's again a bunch of assumptions about how polarizing filters work. Assumptions, they haven't proved any of it. So again, I'll just use my simple frisbee analogy. But if you thought of a polarizing film as jail bars, and you thought of the thing going photon as a frisbee, clearly you could throw the frisbee through the bars, sideways, and it won't go through this way. But the truth is, some of the ones you throw right will end up hitting the bars anyway. So it's not 50-50. The filter, a polarizing filter, doesn't filter 50-50. Now, if you assume it does, then your math results are going to be different than if you recognize, oh, that's right, a certain percentage of the photons will be hit, even though they were going the right way. Even though they had the right polarization, they don't get through. Let's see, what's your idea on how the frequencies form structure? Well, again, I don't do this frequency stuff. The quantum erasure clearly debunks Young. I don't know how it debunks it, so that's just weird. Clearly, I don't see how it clearly does anything. Young's experiment is just Newton's rings all over again. Yes, that's true, but I don't know how it debunks Young as something. And I don't know how the quantum eraser experiment debunks anything but the quantum eraser experiment, because it's just a nonsense experiment. Like the sound on a sound plate, like sand on a sound plate. Again, what does this have to do with anything? Sound is just a perception of us hearing the vibration spread through a medium. The vibration of the speaker is a real thing. It's not sound that makes the sound that makes the sand vibrate. It's the physical movement of the speaker. Okay, this physical movement. Anyway, almost made it for 2 hours. So, I think I'd still like to get the hell out of here. I think I still would like to do that. But you did up the game a little bit. Thank you to the new contributors. Uh, so it was a bit more relevant. Seems to be anyway. Seems it was. But it is, a lot of the same stuff over and over again. And again, I have to get I need someone to argue with. A defender of the conventional model needs to be willing to come into the room with at least a microphone and allow me to voir question them on their understanding and where they derive it from. what facts they consider to be compelling, and then I'll show how their facts are weak. All right, so I guess you guys are tired too. Good. All right. Well, no point in dragging out 15 minutes for no purpose. What about the three filters? Explain your ideas on that. Well, I already explained it. They're not just filters. So the other catch to polarizing light is that it actually physically affects the light. So it doesn't just filter, it affects. So think of it as a frisbee going in a little bit off, and it sort of hits the edge and straightens up. So the force, or whatever, the idea is that a photon that has the wrong polarization, that has a gap. So polarization would be a difference in distance. The ray of light's coming at you, and it's a little bit off. This piece of the ray and this piece of the ray don't line up, and so that's polarization, let's say. And what happens is when light goes through the bars and it's off, it gets turned. So what's happening is that with each, but it can only be like 12 degrees worth of change. So a photon can be off this way and it'll be converted to this. So anything this way or anything this way gets converted to this. So if you understand that's what's happening in the filters, it, it perfectly explains why the light goes through a lot of filters really easily. That you can line up 10 filters, gradually changing them, and you'll capture more of the light. So you'll actually capture more light. You can actually have two crossing filters and you'll get no light. But if you make 10 filters and gradually turn them, the 10 of them, then you'll get 70% of the light, something like that. So, I mean, that's the catch, is that you'll get 70% of 50%. You lose half of it on the first filter. So that's always a problem. First filter hurts you, but the subsequent filters can help you. So it's not just a filter. The actual photons are changed when they go through the filter. So that explains the phenomenon, in my opinion, rather completely. I mean, it's so simple, right? I mean, they consider it a big mystery. It's a big phenomenon. How can this possibly happen? And it's a really simple answer, right? I mean, the answer isn't that elusive when you think about it, right? It's a pretty simple, isn't that a pretty simple answer? But that's how in the box they are. They're so in their wavy, amorphous, dimensional, warpy world that they just can't even see simple answers. They just can't do it. They can't go simple. If it doesn't have a horn and it's not purple, they just can't see. It doesn't. It's not real. It's not. It doesn't have any glitter on it. That's not. That's fake. That can't be a real thing. There's no glitter on it. Well, likewise, get what you deserve. Yes, get what you deserve. Uh, it's a great thing to say to somebody, just because it really does just say, hey, yeah, if I'm been a good person, if I've been a good little Gary, Santa should reward me. Yeah, that's true. But if I've been a nasty little fucker, yeah, the twan, so the asshole, he deleted himself. Thank you. So we know who Al is. Yeah, Al can go to hell. All right. So anyway, I believe I've completed my task and such. So, till the next replacement, you know, that nobody's using as a proper replacement, but whatever. I did it nonetheless. Let's see where they are now. See if that broadcast is broadcasting. Nope. I guess they're on their. Maybe they said goodbye already. I don't know. Today's the last day, right? So maybe they just cut the day short so they can all go to the airport and fly away and crap. So anyway, till the next time and such. I guess I could see what they posted. I don't know. Their titles don't necessarily match the video, unfortunately. A distant view of physics 2.0. I don't know if that probably isn't about any distant view. I mean, this uh, experimental proof of universal force. This guy starts talking about that stupid contracted Earth crap. What does that have to do with a universal force? I mean, that whole wacky small Earth theory is just so fucking. That's way too bold a claim for way too little evidence. And so they're just doing what regular physics does. They just make some shit up and say, well, it fits a little bit. That's all it needs. It just has to fit a little bit. Oh, so this is just he's just reading stuff from a dead guy. So I mean, some old member or something who wrote a tribute to some older member. So yeah, so this doesn't have anything to do with physics either. you know, it doesn't. Oh, I mean, it's not terribly pertinent to anything. I don't think. I mean, blah 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 blah. Some sort of tribute to the great tinfoil hatters of the past. You know. All right, later and such. Let's see. It just has to clove the whole, not even fit. Oh, that was really good. I don't think it was. I don't think that was a good comment. I don't think I have to respond to it. It's just too pathetically, horribly bad. All right. So anyway, till next time. Such.